People keep telling me my first chapter is slow, but I don't know what to cut. Let's solve this recurring problem using a very simple framework. The three most common reasons first chapters start in the wrong place are: the author is warming up before the story begins. They think we need to see normal life before something disrupts it, or they are trying to explain the character before giving us a reason to care. And no matter which one is happening, all three ultimately create the same problem. The result is that the reader reaches the story several pages after the book has started. And the strange thing is that the real opening is often already sitting somewhere inside the manuscript. Sometimes it's on page 3, sometimes page 7, and occasionally it's hiding in chapter 2. I have personally worked on a couple hundred manuscripts, and across our editorial team, we have edited and published thousands. And one of the most common things we do is simply move the beginning. We don't rewrite it or even improve the prose. Most of the time, it is just that, we move it, because the author has already written the opening. They just didn't recognize it. So in this video, I'm going to show you how to find the real beginning of your book, the 3 tests your opening needs to pass, and what to do with everything you cut. Let's start with the first mistake. Writers often begin where the character's day begins. I see this show up in many ways, but the biggest sins are something along the lines of where the character looks in a mirror and describes themselves, or they drive somewhere while thinking about their past. And quite frankly, we simply don't need this warm-up. We need to arrive when the character is already under pressure. I recently worked on a first chapter that demonstrates this very well. It opened with these lines: "At some point in our lives, most of us will feel the power of music in one form or another. For me, it came as a weapon. And tonight, with any luck, it would be a weapon of deterrence, a sound to avert war." Immediately, the reader has questions. How can music be a weapon? What war is he trying to prevent? What is he about to do? So the chapter does not open with the character waking up on the morning of the performance. We aren't watching him practice or travel across London, choose what to wear, arrive at the theatre. Instead, we meet this character backstage at the Royal Opera House moments before he has to perform for a government minister. And that is really the difference between starting with information and starting with pressure. We learn what the character has been doing because tonight's performance forces that information to matter. The backstory is essentially attached to an immediate objective. And starting with pressure doesn't mean that we have to have explosions, right? And that's an important distinction to make. When writers here start with action, they often assume the first page needs to feature a murder or a car chase, or the classic someone running through a forest in the dead of night. Please try and resist that urge. It's also really important to remember that action is not the same as momentum. This chapter I'm using as an example initially contains no physical fight. The protagonist is standing backstage talking to an elderly theatre employee, but the scene still has momentum because he is waiting for the curtain to rise on a performance that matters. So we have anticipation, we have uncertainty, and a clear possibility of failure. He's about to be tested, and ultimately that's what your opening needs. Not necessarily violence, but pressure. The next mistake I often see is revealing normal life through the disruption. Writers are often told to establish normal life before they disrupt it. And that advice is not completely wrong because the reader does need to understand what is being threatened, but you don't need 5 pages of normality before anything changes. Continuing with the chapter example from the previous point, we learn about the protagonist's normal world while he tries to protect it. We discover that he is a musician, he has spent the past year writing songs and building a historical program, that there are people living beneath London, and we may be moving towards a revolution. And we also discover that music in this particular world has a supernatural power. And crucially, none of these details are delivered before the scene begins. They emerge throughout the scene because the protagonist needs the minister to understand them. And really, that's the key principle that I want you to take away from this point is do not explain normal life and then introduce pressure. use the pressure to reveal normal life. It's also really important to give curiosity context. This is especially important in fantasy, historical fiction, and memoir. Writers often believe readers need to understand everything before the story can begin. And it's understandable because maybe there is history of the kingdom, the rules of the magic, previous wars, the protagonist's childhood or family conflict. But readers rarely need all the context immediately. They need a reason to want the context. In this chapter that I'm using as an example, the reader does not fully understand what music as a weapon means on the first page. That is precisely why the phrase works so well. The chapter is creating the question first. Then the performance gradually gives us the answer. The protagonist sings, the supernatural system becomes visible, music begins affecting memory and emotion, and so the reader learns the rules while watching those rules being used. Curiosity comes first and explanation follows. Backstory becomes interesting once it answers a question the story has already created. Starting correctly is really only half the job, and this is exactly why developmental editing is so valuable. It is incredibly difficult to see where your own story really begins, where the momentum drops, or where important backstory is arriving too early, because you already know your book too well. A developmental editor reads the manuscript as a reader would. They look beyond grammar and individual sentences to the opening structure, pacing, character arcs, and whether every chapter is moving the story forward. Our team has spent the past 12 years working across thousands of manuscripts. So if you would like an experienced editor to help you find the strongest version of your book, you can submit your manuscript or book a strategy call using the links below. There is another useful lesson in this chapter example. The opening begins in the right place, but later during the performance, the narration pauses to explain a large amount of what happened in the previous books. The information is relevant, the reader may eventually need it, but it arrives just as the tension of the performance is building. This shows that starting in the right place is not enough on its own. You have to also protect the momentum after you have created it. Every time you stop an active scene to explain the past, ask, does the reader need this information right now? Could one detail communicate the same thing? Maybe could the information emerge through the character's reaction? Could I even delay it until the reader is actively asking for it? In this case, instead of pausing for a chronological recap of the previous year, some of the history could emerge through the protagonists looking towards the people in the audience. So, for example, the composer whose life his program is designed to preserve, he notices a child who can be endangered by the conflict if it escalates, and he sees people depending on him to make his peaceful plan work. And with this approach, now the past is not simply being explained, it's creating pressure inside the present scene. So after receiving all of this information, you're probably thinking, so where should your novel begin? And the simple line to remember is near the first irreversible change. That doesn't mean the irreversible event has to happen in the opening sentence. In this example that I'm using, the chapter does not begin with the eventual attack. It begins with the protagonist pursuing the peaceful solution that the attack will then destroy. He enters this chapter believing government funding can legitimize his program, prevent a revolution, and he succeeds on that, but then armed attackers enter the theater. And so by the end of the chapter, he cannot simply return to the plan that he had at the beginning. That is an irreversible change. The opening works because everything before that change is actively building towards it. And really, here is the key test for your opening. Look at your first chapter and ask 3 key questions. What does my protagonist want right now? What pressure makes obtaining it difficult? What happens that prevents them from returning completely to the position they occupied at the beginning? If the protagonist wants nothing yet, the opening may be too early. If there is no pressure, then the scene will be static. And if nothing changes, you may have written setup rather than a chapter. Your story does not need to begin with an explosion, but it should begin with a live situation. A character trying to achieve something, a question the reader wants answered, and pressure that is already beginning to close in. What you really want to keep in mind is that a story doesn't begin when the character's day begins. It begins when the outcome of that day starts to matter. Now, take a look at your first chapter. What is the first moment where something genuinely changes, and what page does it appear on? Let me know in the comments. I try and read as many as I can. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.